Alan Thornbody.
And I'm Lana Underwood.
Our top story tonight, PPE. What is it? How is it used? And more importantly, are there differences in the infectious disease transmission rates between reusable and disposable PPE? And also, which is more beneficial in terms of cost effectiveness and protection of patients and staff?
Our reporter in the field, Skip McKenzie, has more on the story.
Thanks, Lana. We're here at Med Center 1 to interview Dr. Carrico, who is a nurse and also a doctor. She works closely with the CDC as an infectious disease specialist. How would you describe the impact personal protective equipment has made on transmission rates within the hospital?
Well, I think, PPE, kind of as a general category, really emerged in response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic. That there was the thought about, how do I protect the healthcare worker? Now, we had always in the past had gowns and gloves and so forth, but before it really came to be part of mainstream thought with infection prevention and control, it wasn't used as tremendously as it's used now. So, it took a large step forward when we began to think about how do we protect the healthcare worker from what the patient has. And then as we began to see more and more of the pathogens causing infectious issues and transmission issues, then the focus then expanded so that we thought, well, wait a minute, what type of protection then do we need to have so that we can then prevent transmission from a patient to either the healthcare worker and then from the healthcare worker to another patient, or even from patient to patient sometimes. So the focus really expanded. But I think many people believe that where things kind of took the big leap was with the idea that we have to do something because people are failing, healthcare personnel specifically, are failing to be attentive to the basics of standard precautions or the basics of infection prevention.
So, all of the hospitals downtown use certain types of personal protective equipment, or PPE. In your experience, have you noticed a difference in transmission rates of different infectious diseases between reusable or disposable PPE?
I can't really say that I've noticed a difference in transmission rates when you're using reusable PPE or single-use disposable PPE. But the whole idea is that we have to somehow align those choices with several objectives. Number one is certainly an environmental objective, that we know that with disposable PPE, there's tons then of waste that is being generated, and then we have to do something with the waste. Versus the reusable PPE, where we can use once, hopefully, and then go ahead and then have that laundered in a standard way so that it is then available for the next user. Each one of those has their pros and their cons, certainly. And we know that when used correctly, when processes are used correctly, then the reusable PPE can be very economical.
How can PPE protect against bloodborne pathogens and nosocomial infections in the hospital environment?
Well, again, PPE is designed to be a barrier. So what I do when I teach people, I'm like, okay, let's keep it really simple. If it's wet and not yours, don't touch it. Don't get it on you, right? So if you're going to be in contact with something, whether it's a patient's body fluids directly from them or part of the environment, then I have to somehow figure out how do I make sure that those organisms do not become part of my ecology. How do I make sure that I don't bring them as part of either my hands or something else that I'm going to be using that may be a vehicle for transmission to another patient or maybe even to me. So PPE is designed to be that type of barrier. So we always have to have healthcare personnel thinking about how do I provide that high quality care in a very high touch environment, but also make sure then that I'm protected not only so that I don't acquire an illness, but that I don't then carry that around, because we know many of these organisms can adhere very effectively to our hands. So we can then transmit and transfer things all over the place. So PPE definitely has a value. However, it should not be a default for basic infection prevention and control. And if you look historically, the reason we even have contact type of precautions is again because of our failure as healthcare personnel to understand the mechanics of how microbes are transmitted and what our role is in prevention. You know, I can't see these organisms on my hands or on my equipment or even on my person. Therefore, sometimes I forget that they're there, you know, and when I'm performing all of these patient care tasks, I just forget some of these very important details. And so the addition of personal protective equipment was designed not only to be that barrier, but also to be that visual cue so that I remember, oh yeah, there's something in this environment or with this patient that represents a risk to someone else.
What types of infectious diseases are spread within the hospital when PPE is not effectively used?
Well, you can have spread of anything from a traditional bloodborne pathogen like hepatitis B or even HIV if things are not used correctly. So for example, you know, right now there is a lot of attention going on with the blood glucose monitoring. And we have little jars of the test strips. Well, now we're finding actual blood inside those bottles, showing that somehow somebody's not using correct barrier precautions, right? Either they are reusing a glove or they are going patient to patient, doing finger stick after finger stick with blood then that gets on their gloves and then they go into these reusable bottles. So we're seeing, and to me that's a great demonstration that even with PPE, if you forget who you're trying to protect, you know, right now if you walk into an emergency department, you'll probably see every person there has on a pair of gloves. Or if you've ever seen EMS, you know, as soon as they arrive at a scene, first thing that goes on are gloves and they wear them the entire time. Well, they're wearing gloves to protect themselves, right? But what about the need to protect the patient? What about if I want to make sure that I'm not transmitting something to another patient? Then in the mind of the healthcare worker, we have to make sure that that kind of schizophrenic approach, right? Who am I protecting? Both people. Has to constantly be in their mind. And in order to do that, you have to have some kind of a plan. You have to understand, when do I need to change this? And do I have it available? Is it readily available for me? Do I have time? Should I make time? And so it requires then a lot of thought and a lot of planning on the part of the healthcare worker.
PPE protects both patients and staff from infectious disease, but it's not infallible and requires proper training in order to use. What can you tell us about training staff in the proper use of protective personal equipment?
Anytime anyone is going to wear personal protective equipment, the responsibilities in ensuring that not only it's available but it's used correctly really cross a lot of job responsibilities. For example, people in materials management, it is critical that they understand what are the standards for a proper fluid resistant gown, or what is that item going to be used for, so they are competent to ensure that we have proper selection. And because the expense is so great, unless you have that type of skill and expertise in materials management, you can get into big trouble. If someone doesn't understand that there are standards, you know, how should the cuff fit? You know, what type of respiratory protection do we need? Does it need to be strike-through protection? Does it need to be fluid resistant? So you've got to make sure materials management knows their thing, number one. Number two, you've got to make sure the users understand, how do I properly select the type of PPE that I need? And then how do I put it on? And then how do I take it off so that I protect myself? And then how do I dispose of it? So when we think about the competencies that are necessary for healthcare personnel, those are the basics. How do I select the right type of PPE? Do I need a mask, or do I need a mask with a face shield? Do I need a respirator, or do I just need a surgical mask? They need to understand how to select. Then they need to understand, how do I put it on? So for example, how do I put on a respirator? Do I have the straps put on correctly so I can perform an adequate fit check before I use it? How do I put on a gown? Do I tie it in the back? Do I tie it in the front? How am I going to get my hands around, you know, to make sure? What needs to come off first so I don't contaminate myself? Do I put it in regular trash? When, if ever, should it go in regulated waste, red bag waste? So the competencies that are necessary for healthcare personnel are really quite extensive. So that shows not only the level of training, but it also shows all the possible gaps for when we can have what I call a PPE misadventure. You know, how when things go wrong, there are lots of opportunities for things to go wrong.
What can you tell us about the role of PPE in natural disasters or epidemics, such as with SARS or the swine flu?
Right. Well, you know, again, then if you're looking at those situations, I would think that we're looking at it from how do we protect the healthcare worker. So like with SARS or with many of these emerging pathogens, which I'd remind you, many of the emerging pathogens that we see have a strong respiratory component. So we think at that point, how do we ensure the safety of the workforce? Because someone's got to provide care. And if I feel like I come to work in the environment and it's not safe for me, do you think I'm going to come back? Probably not. If I feel like that I cannot safely do my job, I'm going to be very reluctant to come to the environment to work. So we have to ensure that healthcare workers are protected. So we have that level of PPE. As a healthcare worker, I need to understand the basics of disease transmission, how our disease is transmitted. And then what are those critical points where I can intervene to stop that from happening? The biggest things are hand hygiene. Hand hygiene, hand hygiene, hand hygiene. Top three things. The next thing then is how do I make sure that somehow I've got that barrier so that I'm able to block then transmission or carrying that organism somewhere, either back out of that patient environment so that I can transmit it, you know, or make that part of the general ecology of the unit, or then how do I just literally take it into another patient room and come in contact. So, you know, we're thinking about both sides, protecting the healthcare worker, protecting the patient, preventing then the transmission into the environment, where then it becomes a free-for-all for everybody to touch and transmit.
Is there anything else that you would like to add about PPE or infectious disease?
I think that the basics are, you know, that as a healthcare professional, we have got a responsibility to do our best job, not just one day, but every day, every patient encounter. And then we have to recognize that we don't live in a sterile environment and that there are always new pathogens emerging. You know, organisms have two things to think about. How do I stay alive and how do I multiply? Consequently, they're very good because they've only got those two things. Now, can you imagine how good would we be if we only had two things to think about, right? So we're always going to be chasing after the organisms. They're always going to be ahead of us. So our thought always has to be, how do I ensure that I'm not enabling this to happen? What do I need to do my best work every time, my best job every time with that patient? Because the patients depend upon us. You know, when they look at nursing, you know, repeatedly, nurses, if you ask people, what are the professions that you have the most confidence in, that you trust the most? Nursing is always right up there at the top. And so we've got that responsibility to our patients. So we have to focus on what is it that we need to do, whether it's involved with PPE or just basic infection prevention practice, and do our best work. Because we've got to remember that patient may be our family member. We may be the person on the other side of that bed rail, and so we need to make sure that adequate and high quality infection prevention practice is part of the way we do business, not one day, but every day.
Great story, compelling and rich. Here with us tonight reporting on the history of PPE is Channel 4's very own Dick Cunningham. Dick?
Thank you, Alana. PPE was discovered in the Germans in 1904. They named it PPE, which of course in German means a whale's...
No, there's no way that's correct.
I'm sorry, I was just trying to impress you.
Oh.
I don't know what it means. Honestly, I don't think anyone knows what it means. Scholars maintain that the translation was lost hundreds of years ago.
Doesn't it mean personal protective equipment?
No.
No, that's what it means, really.
Well, agree to disagree. Up until the 1800s, there were no surgical gowns, drapes, or wrappers to promote sterile field. The concept of the germ theory was introduced at a time through the efforts of Louis Pasteur, thought milk was a good choice, Joseph Lister, and Robert Koch, all of whom endeavored independently. As a result of these efforts, the germ theory evolved. The idea, obviously today, represented a breakthrough more than 100 years ago. This theory was about certain diseases which were caused by microorganisms, too small to be seen except through a microscope, which could be wrong, but I believe is an old wooden ship used in the Civil War era. The development of the sterile field, generally accredited to Florence Nightingale, was a practical response to the germ theory. Can we bring Miss Florence in, Miss Nightingale? Is she here for an interview? What? She's dead? She's Oh, I'm sorry. Today and in recent years, the combined use of surgical gowns, drapes, and wrappers, along with other products and procedures, are utilized to promote sterility in the operating room. Originally, all textile components used to maintain a sterile procedure were reusable. These were all cotton materials that were laundered and sterilized prior to each. Many new reusable products have been introduced during the last 5 decades. During the middle part of the 20th century, single-use disposable products were introduced to the healthcare sector and have dominated the surgical textile area in recent years.
Thanks, Dick. To study the current use of PPE in the field today, the news team headed to Randy Savage Memorial Hospital. What you're about to see is a Channel 4 exclusive.
Here at Randy Savage Memorial Hospital, we value our patients, so we value our PPE. PPE is personal protective equipment. PPE includes gloves, gowns, and masks, and caps. Our staff here at Randy Savage Memorial don't necessarily use their PPE the way it should be. I never know what they're doing with that PPE.
That sounds more terrifying than a flying elbow drop. We now go to Lana Underwood in the studio for a Channel 4 exclusive interview.
To discuss the financial aspects of disposable versus reusable PPE, we've asked Nobel Prize-winning economist, leading medical financial researcher, and former Subway sandwich artist, Harvey Bernstein, to join us in studio. Harvey, thank you for being here today.
Well, thanks, Lana. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, tell us, Harvey, which type of PPE, disposable or reusable, is more cost-effective?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Lana. A study in 2006 by Howard Zins, we call him Howie downtown, found out that reusable PPE only costs $2.25 a piece, but disposable PPE costs $4.90. That's almost as much as a $5 footlong. Another study by my friend Dr. Buzniak in 2004 looked at ICUs that were trying to change to reusable PPE. It cost them $70,000 to change to this model, but they ended up saving $400,000 in cost they would have gotten if they had bacteria transmission stuff going on in the ICU. So,
That's terrific, Harvey. Though, I think the viewers, along with myself, would like to know which type of PPE is better for our precious Mother Earth.
yeah, Mother Earth is a good thing to keep in mind. There's a lit review by Michael Overcash in 2012, not too long ago, Lana, not too long ago, 2012. And he looked at the environmental impact of disposable PPE versus reusable PPE. And what he found was that the reusable PPE actually made less of a carbon footprint. So it didn't pollute the environment as much. There wasn't water pollution and air pollution and all this
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, Harvey. That concludes our broadcast for this evening. For all of us here at Channel 4 News, I'm Alan Thornbody.
And I'm Lana Underwood.
You stay classy, School of Nursing.
And thanks for stopping by.
But mainly, stay classy.
Thanks for stopping by.
Stay classy. I'm Alan Thornbody.
Thanks for stopping by.
Stay classy. I'm Thornbody.
Thanks for stopping by.
Stay classy.